Welcome back to this episode where we'll be taking a look at the steps that led to the American Revolution and their fight for independence. The American Revolutionary War began in 1775 as open conflict between the colonists and Great Britain had ensued. Now, no one thing can be pinpointed as the cause of the Revolutionary War, but there are some things that we've looked at in the past that helped lead to it, like the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, just to name a couple. But another thing that helped lead to it as well was simply geography. The vast distance between Great Britain and America. And we're looking at over about 3,000 miles of water. Left a distance that created a feeling of independence amongst the Americans. However, the French and Indian War had a profound impact on the British and American relations. It was with the conclusion of this war that brought about the end of roughly 100 years of what we call salutary neglect. Now, salutary neglect was a time period where the colonists had developed their own sense of identity, an economy that was kind of their own political institutions, beliefs, and even their language. During this time, Parliament really had no understanding or knowledge of the colonial affairs that was going on over in America. And at the end of the French and Indian War, the colonists had developed an optimistic outlook on life. However, the British were in deep debt because of that war, as we had discussed earlier. And because of that, they start to reorganize their empire and will start to levy taxes and pass other acts that will upset the colonists. One of those early acts is the Proclamation Line of 1763, which you can see on the map by that red line going down the Appalachian Mountains. And what that proclamation said basically was that the colonists were forbidden from going west of the Appalachians, and that confined them to living on the eastern coast where the rules, laws, taxes, and regulations could be easily enforced. And another effect would be that by not being able to move west, there's less of a chance of coming in conflict with the natives that still lived out there. Several other things that upset the colonists as well was at this time after the war, England had stationed a large peacetime army in the colonies. And the Americans kind of were curious why those soldiers needed to be there during a time of peace. And they kind of saw them as a nemesis. And then also to mention that some of those redcoats would compete for jobs with the colonists as well. And so, with the conclusion of the French and Indian War, the period of salutary neglect basically comes to an end. Now, to generate some of that revenue and recoup their losses, Britain will pass the Sugar Act of 1764, which taxed goods coming into the colonies from other places, like perhaps molasses from the West Indies. But it also passes probably a more important one, the Stamp Act of 1765, because this one affects the masses more. This Stamp Act was imposed by the British taxes upon all paper products and stamped them once the tax had been paid. Now, this applied to things like marriage certificates, maybe diplomas, land transactions, and even newspapers. So this really had a more far-reaching consequences. More people were affected. And the idea that kind of came into question then was the idea of parliamentary sovereignty. And this was the belief by Parliament that they reigned supreme and were able to pass acts as they saw fit, even though they had no understanding of kind of the colonial affairs and what was going on and how these would be received. And what it did was it kind of caused some of the colonial assemblies to kind of question the right of Parliament to pass these as simply ways of trying to generate revenue. After all, these assemblies had grown in strength under their own accords during the period of salutary neglect, as I'd mentioned before. And because of the Stamp Act, we see various forms of protest taking place. In one, what becomes known as the Stamp Act Congress, 9 colonies had sent representatives to meet to discuss what to do. And what they decide upon is a colonial-wide boycott, or the idea of non-importation. This belief that if they didn't import goods made from England, it would put some economic strains upon England and maybe repeal the Stamp Act. As they were boycotting these English goods, women got involved and made homespun, or clothing from home, rather than buying the imports that were brought in from England. And also, colonists agreed to boycott luxury goods at the same time to further hurt the economy of England. Other forms of protests that one might see was Patrick Henry, a prominent Virginian who got up in the House of Burgesses to give this passionate anti-Stamp Act speech, and he gave reasons for not following it and getting it overturned. And eventually, Virginia passes what becomes known as the Virginia Resolves, which does encourage the colonists to fight against the Stamp Act. And eventually the press circulates these resolves, drums up more support. However, we even see more, maybe extreme forms of protest as well. The Sons of Liberty, which would be led by Sam Adams, a New Englander who was kind of a very emotional, kind of like firebrand of the Revolutionary War. He's the one guy that's always going to fight against any injustice that the British do upon the colonists. But these Sons of Liberty would take it upon themselves to be a little bit more, more aggressive in their forms of protests. Burning down tax collectors' offices, hanging tax collectors in effigy. The threat of tarring and feathering tax collectors. They did so many of these things that the tax collectors were really kind of feared their lives, and sometimes even ran away for their own safety. And so you can see through these various forms of protests, eventually they do take its toll on England, and with the help of Ben Franklin negotiating, eventually Parliament does repeal the Stamp Act. However, upon repealing it, they also pass the Declaratory Act, which simply declares their right to pass acts as they see best fitting the colonists. If we fast forward a couple years to March 5th, 1770, Boston, Massachusetts, we have the fabled Boston Massacre. Now, what kind of led up to this? The Stamp Act had been repealed, but the Townshend duties had been put in its place in 1767. But what we see here by 1770 is that the peacetime army of the British was still located in the colonies, and that kind of heightened tensions. Along with being the fact that they didn't really get paid that well for being in the army, they would take part-time jobs when they weren't on active duty, and that would lead to job competition with the colonists. Well, as some of the colonists kind of started surrounding the redcoats and hurling insults and snowballs and what have you at them, all of a sudden, some shots ring out, killing several and wounding other colonists, including Crispus Attucks, who some kind of consider the first casualty or first person killed in the Revolutionary War, as he was a free man, a free black man who was killed here at Boston Massacre. And the famous etching by Paul Revere, which he's probably more famous for his Midnight Ride, but here's his etching that is going to be published in newspapers and pamphlets throughout the colonies, kind of showing of the atrocities of the British, trying to kind of raising the possibility of armed resistance to try to fight back. So you kind of see the continual increase in tensions between the colonists and the redcoats play out. And then still a few years after the Boston Massacre, you have the Gaspee incident, which the Gaspee was a duties or customs ship of the British that would stop ships and kind of make sure that they paid their taxes. And sometimes they'd harass the sailors of the boats and kind of treat them with disrespect. And the colonists around the area kind of grew tired of what the Gaspee symbolized. And one night off the coast of Rhode Island, as the ship was following some merchant ships, it ran aground, and that night some colonists go out to the ship and actually burn it down. And as the British investigate, the colonists did not cooperate, and the British were never able to figure out who did it and hold those people accountable. So it was just kind of another act of aggression against the British. Also in 1772, we see Sam Adams once again helping to organize what becomes known as the Committee of Correspondence, simply a way of kind of communicating throughout the colonies, so that people in the South know what's going on in New England, and New Englanders can hear about any wrongdoings from in the South or Middle colonies, just a way to kind of keep each other informed about British wrongdoings. And yet another step on the road to independence. Wow, we can't forget the Boston Tea Party in December of 1773, whereas the English had done away with many of the taxes on other goods. The one on tea was left, and even though this taxed tea was still cheaper than other tea they could buy from other companies or countries, just the fact that it had a tax still on it was what the colonists detested. So in the cover of darkness, as the colonists dressed up as Native Americans and stormed the ship to throw the tea over, that will then lead to King George passing the Intolerable Acts, also known as the Coercive Acts. Now, there are several parts to these acts. One, the Royal Navy would blockade Boston Harbor, so no colonial goods could be sent out until the tea had been paid for. Two, colonists had to quarter the British soldiers that were being sent over, as more were on their way. The king also assigned General Gage to be Massachusetts governor. And so, along with the idea that if people would be tried back in England for their wrongdoings in the colonies rather than standing trial in the colonies. In response to the Coercive Acts, the colonists sent 55 delegates from every colony but Georgia, who simply agreed to go along with all the measures, to Philadelphia in September of 1774. And some of the most prominent men met here, including George Washington, Sam Adams, John Adams, and Patrick Henry. And eventually they passed what becomes known as the Suffolk Resolve. And this called for forcible resistance to the Coercive Acts, including non-importation, which would be once again a boycott of English goods, which would be enforced with some rigor throughout the colonies. And even though many of these men didn't really know each other, they actually resolved to begin training citizens for war, which was really a pretty major step at this point, even though most people were still hoping to avoid war at all costs. They also discussed how best to limit the power of Parliament and how to define American rights. But as the First Continental Congress adjourned in September of 1774, it's only until the next spring, April of 1775, when the first shots of the Revolutionary War are heard at Lexington and Concord.